Howdy, folks. I want to start a new segment that I'm going to do as regularly as humanly possible, and it's called Defines. And the reason I want to do this is I'm noticing that a lot of words that we kind of took for granted not that long ago are being redefined. And there are actually words that have been redefined a long time ago, and some of those I'm going to include. In fact, I'm going to start with one of those that have also happened. And the thing is words and definitions do change, especially today with social media and the broad media. Words can completely change definitions. And so I want to make sure that people are aware of what things actually mean. And so that when they're using a word, they're using it properly. And I know for myself, this was a huge learning experience as time went on. And maybe yourself or somebody you know maybe has a viewpoint of what a word actually is based on what the controlling mechanisms of society have maybe told them what it is, instead of what it actually legitimately is supposed to mean. And so for our first defines, the first one I want to do is the word capitalism. And I think a lot of people listening to this are going to sit there and say, because I'm sure a lot of you are from, Western capitalist countries, you're going to say, well, I live in it. I know what it is. I can see it every day. I'm happy about it, or I'm not happy about it. I have my view based on the world around me and what I'm seeing. But what I would say is that capitalism maybe is actually defined a little differently than what we're living in today. And I'm going to prove that to you right now. So the first thing we need to do is look at what the dictionary itself says capitalism actually is. And it says it's an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state, which is a pretty general and pretty good definition. Now, unfortunately, the way that people viewed capitalism pre the early teens to the way that they view it now is a little different, and I'm going to explain why. And I'm going to explain why that version in the past is probably better. So, what we had back in those days was we had a government that was able to issue currency or add money to the money supply of the country, interest-free. And Canada and the United States in particular, it's right in their constitution. In our constitution in Canada, in the American Constitution, it says very clearly that our government is allowed to add money to the money supply if necessary, interest-free. In other words, they're not borrowing it from a private bank. They're just putting it out. And that, yes, that will devalue the currency based on how much they put in, but they're not devaluing it even further or 10 times that by having to pay interest. See, what we have today is governments borrow from banks, add money to the money supply, and then they're forced to borrow more to pay the interest on the debt. And that's why people wonder, how come government debt just keeps inflating, and never really goes down? Well, that's because they're borrowing to pay for borrowing to pay for borrowing, okay? That was not what we had in pure capitalism, as I would define it, or the initial capitalism, the first capitalism, okay? We didn't have that, okay? And so when the government added money to the money supply, the value of the dollar only decreased so much. But as I will show you in the last 100 years, it's decreased exponentially. It's crazy. So here's the thing about the olden days that we need to understand. Under true pure capitalism, where government is not borrowing from banks, you still had banks, and they still loaned money to private individuals, and that was a voluntary exchange, and the interest rate was discussed, and there was a contract involved, and that was the way it was. There's nothing wrong with banks in that regard. I'm not attacking banks. But what you also need to understand is under pure capitalism, what happened? So America was founded, and for a while, up until 1913 and Woodrow Wilson, they had pure capitalism. Woodrow Wilson changed that, the president at the time. And think about what happened during that period of time. What was invented? Everything awesome. Name it. Electricity, the radio. I mean, on and on and on and on and on. The biggest inventions, the things that saved people and increased the quality of life for people and decreased the mortality rate, those things were invented during Pure capitalism. Now, during that time, you also had banking families from Europe trying to manipulate the US government into accepting a privately controlled central bank. Now, this is where we get to the crux of the matter. People in those days, the value of the dollar was crazy high. Like, for instance, in 1912, people say, oh, well, a jug of milk was four cents. Yeah, because the value of the dollar was that high. Now, since then, I think today in the US, it's lost 1,175% or something of its buying power. And what that means is it's like more than 10 times devalued compared to what it was. That's why, 100 times. And that's why it was 4 cents for a jug of milk in 1912. It's $4 now. That's a massive, massive increase. This is where we get to what happened in 1913, and Canada went down this road as well. We went down it to pay for wars, to banking families, and then in 1970, though, we had paid it off, and then Pierre Elliott Trudeau decided to go ahead and borrow from, even though he didn't have to. Woodrow Wilson put it through. It was around Christmas time, where now, instead of the government just saying, okay, we're going to add money to the money supply because this, and this is going on, we need to do that. Now it's, we're going to add money to the money supply, but now we have to borrow it through the Federal Reserve Act from a private bank. And it is private, make no mistake. It has nothing to do with the U.S. government other than the president appoints the chairman, okay? But let's face it, all these chairmen seem to be of the same ilk. They don't really change, do anything different. Alan Greenspan, who was a chairman, was interviewed in the 90s and said the government has absolutely no say over what they do or how they do it or how much money they pump in or anything like that, okay? This is what I call crony capitalism. And that's why the debt never goes down. As Canadians, we're watching our Prime Minister right now rack up the debt. It just never ends, never ends, never ends, never ends. Because he's borrowing from private banks, which he doesn't have to do. And in fact, I actually called my federal MP a number of years ago, who also ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And I said to him, why are we borrowing at interest when we could add money to the supply interest-free from the Bank of Canada, which our Constitution states? And he went off on this whole big thing, oh, there's going to be inflation and there's going to be too. And I sat there and I went, are you out of your mind? We're paying inflation on interest. So you're paying inflation upon inflation upon inflation. It never ends. And we're borrowing from the same stupid families that we try to get the heck out of Europe to get away from. Hello. So anyway, it doesn't make any sense. But the bottom line is, this is not real capitalism because we pay taxes to service this debt. Imagine, and here's a prime example. Imagine, say, the government of Ontario, who has borrowed so much money that every month they pay $1 billion. This is Ontario, Canada. $1 billion, and California is even worse. But they pay $1 billion a month in interest. Okay, imagine if that didn't exist. You still had debt, and you still had to pay the principal, but you didn't have to pay the interest on the debt. That's $1 billion a month that would be inside the Ontario economy. And people talk, oh, we need social programs, this. Would you? Would you need as many of those if you had $1 billion a month more in revenue? And it never goes down because they can never raise taxes high enough because all they ever do is borrow. So the true capitalism, folks, is a totally private enterprise where banks loan to private individuals. They do not loan to governments. This is the classical definition. What you are living under, what I am living under right now, is crony capitalism. And actually what it really is, as defined by David Rockefeller, and it's only going to get worse as we globalize further, is a situation where it's communism mixed with what he called super capitalism. In other words, our countries, the West, are slowly communizing everything, right? More regulations, more government, more stipulations, more permission slips, more money spent on those programs, okay? So we are moving further into government control of our everyday lives, where the big giant corporations and banks are under a different set of rules, which is super capitalism, he calls it, which means they have all sorts of tax exemptions. Everybody complains about that. They're never going to go away because our government is bought and paid for. They have all these things that they can do so they don't actually have to service those interest payments. We do. So it's communism, or right now it's communism light. We're not China yet, but we're headed there. And super capitalism for the global conglomerates, which are slowly taking over everything.